I am so pleased to be here. I originally was going to come out last March, but something happened in March that delayed the lecture. But I am very glad to be able to talk to you now on the eve of this momentous election season, the 2020 election, to talk about this issue of that has recurred and perplexed many people, the Electoral College. But first, I'd especially like to thank the Minnesota Historical Society for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to talk to this audience. I'm originally from the Midwest myself, and so I really am glad to be with you, if only virtually, and the Organization of American Historians, which is the most important organization for historians who study the United States. So in any case, I would like to now get to my lecture. I'm going to dig deep into this issue, and so I really hope that you feel free to pose questions through the chat box, and I'll try to get to them at the end. And it does get rather technical. And so what I'd like to say is that there have been a number of recent books, including an excellent one by Alexander Kesar on the Electoral College recently. But in my opinion, what they don't do is really explain the origins of the Electoral College. And without understanding in depth those origins, I think people get really frustrated and don't really have a good grasp on both the reasons for why we have the Electoral College and what possibly could be done, if anything, to alleviate the problems. So let me plunge into this. And as I say, I hope we have time for questions, and I hope everyone can hear as well as they can through this medium. So what I'm going to do is I do have a nice PowerPoint, and through technology that should give you the PowerPoint. And I am going to minimize myself and start talking. So the Electoral College has angered and perplexed and bewildered Americans almost since the moment of its creation. Its creation at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 was the result of a great compromise, different from the compromise that gave us the Congress, Senate, and House of Representatives, but related to that. In any case, there have been hundreds of amendments throughout American history to try and reform or abolish the Electoral College. As you might know, in 1969, the Congress came close to passing an amendment that might have eventually led to the elimination of the Electoral College. It passed in the House of Representatives, but failed in the Senate. But that's the most recent serious effort. But at the time, it was simply regarded as this structure that got the framers of the Constitution to where they wanted. That is, to some balance of interest that would result in the election of a president. So, how did we get to this very strange jerry-built system? To understand that, you really have to understand the Articles of Confederation. That's the government that preceded our government under the U.S. Constitution. The Articles of Confederation were actually written in 1776 and ratified in 1781, but during the whole American Revolution, they are the structure of government that prevailed. And this structure of government was a loose union among the 13 states in the United States. And in this confederation, which literally means a loose union of states, each state had one vote. All the states came into the revolution as states with a long history and tradition that was separate from all the other states. And people in each of the states had a separate identity. And that state equality, that principle of state equality, was very ingrained in the United States from the beginning. The idea that the states were separate and distinct and had their own identity and should have an equal voice in this new union that was created to fight the British during the American Revolution. All right, well, as we know, this Confederation was not an effective way of governing after the American Revolution was over. And it's in the 1780s, and it countered serious challenges that, that really threatened the existence of the Union. The Union was on the verge, at least according to many political leaders, of falling apart if the Union was not strengthened, if there was not a stronger national government to prevail over and to control and contain the 13 states. And that's what led in 1787 to the Constitutional Convention. And at that Constitutional Convention, as you know, a whole new form of government, different from a confederation, was forged. It was a republic, one republic, a nation made up of 13 republics, that is the states. And each state retained a lot of autonomy. Each state retained a lot of power. But that new national government, Congress and the president, were given great new powers, and those powers were then what was greatly contested at the Constitutional Convention and called for a lot of debate and compromise. Exactly how many powers, how strong this new central government would be, how much it could control and contain the powers of the states. Now, that resulted, as we know, in the creation of the House of Representatives, which represents the people in the states, and the people voted for the members of the House of Representatives, and the creation of the Senate, the upper house, where the states received an equal vote, two votes per state, okay? So that principle of state equality was preserved in the Constitution, even though in the lower house, we now have a principle of what we would call popular representation or democratic representation introduced into the National Congress. Now, I want to note here that in the original Constitution of 1787, it was the state legislatures that voted for the senators. So that Senate was really the reflection of the states. And as I mentioned, really embodied that principle of state equality. Now, as we know, that was later amended in the 20th century, and we have a popular vote for the Senate now. But, and this causes great consternation, many people say, oh, but the Senate is not democratic because you have two votes per state, regardless of the population. Well, that was not the purpose of the Senate, and I'm sad to tell you that that is probably the most impossible part of the US Constitution to change. Under Article 5 of the Constitution, it requires the unanimous consent of all the states in the Union to change the equal vote provision for the Senate under Article 5. So that idea of state equality is embedded, is hardwired into our Constitution, whether we like it or not. It's a remnant and reflection of the Articles of Confederation. It's a reflection and a remnant of that colonial past where each colony was founded at different times for different purposes and had separate identities going into the American Revolution, okay? So I think it's critical to understand that, to understand why we then have the Electoral College. So one of the next important innovations that occurred was that the Constitutional Convention debated the question of how to elect the president. Now, the idea of a president was in and of itself controversial at this time because previously, under the Articles, there had been an individual called a president, but he was simply an administrative officer. But the previous chief executive in the colonial period had been the king, and we know how well that worked out. And so people in the early United States were very reluctant about entrusting a lot of power into the hands of a single individual, into what's a person that reminded them of a king. And many historians believe that if it hadn't been for the presence of George Washington, that members of the Constitutional Convention would not have had sufficient confidence to have a provision for a single executive in the Constitution. Now, I know this is all a lot of background, but I think that you really have to understand this background to understand why we have such an arcane and unusual system for electing the president. You know, there were debates actually over whether you should have a single executive or a plural executive, but once they finally agreed on a single executive, they then had to decide, you know, how that individual would be elected. And so there were a lot of conflicts over this issue too. And the conflicts involved, well, first of all, under Madison's original plan, the president or chief executive was to be elected from Congress. But a lot of members of the Federal Constitutional Convention feared that if Congress elected the president, that there would be too many factions and too much intrigue within the Congress, and that the chief executive would lack true independence from the Congress. He would be a creature of the Congress, and you couldn't attain that separation of powers that many people desired. And so, so there was a hope then, there was a move then to find some other way than what Madison had proposed in order to elect the president. There were proposals championed especially by James Wilson of Pennsylvania to allow the people to elect the president. But this too caused consternation. There was a segment of the delegation, there were some members at the Constitutional Convention who feared the people, who feared that the people didn't have enough information to make a good judgment about who the president should be. They feared that the people might be swayed by passions or interests and not make a rational choice. They feared that they'd be susceptible to demagogues who would promise them whatever they wanted to hear. So there was a suspicion of direct election of the president. Then the constituency that supported state equality wanted the state governors or state legislatures to elect the president. But that proposal too encountered a lot of resistance. There was a fear that states would gang up in regional consortiums and promote their own regional candidate, or that the state legislatures or the governors would not be attentive enough to the popular will. And so they were in a bind. How should this new chief executive or president be elected? So finally, after a lot of debate, after a lot of back and forth and consternation, they did what people always do when they're in a big meeting and can't decide what to do. They delegated the issue to a smaller group, and they gave it to, late in the convention proceedings, to the Rarely Committee on Postponed Matters. They kept postponing what to do and finally handed it off to a smaller committee. And when they finally made up the proposal, which is embodied in Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, what they decided, what they proposed, and remember, this all had to be approved by the people in the states. It had to be ratified by the majority, 2/3 majority of the states before the Constitution would go into effect. But in any case, these were the provisions. The state legislatures would get the power to decide how the individuals in their state would be elected. either by state legislators or by the people in the states. The method of apportioning the votes, whether by the state legislators or by the people, would be up to the states. And this new body called an Electoral College, called and created specifically and only for the purpose of voting for the president, would cast the votes for both the president and vice president. And each state would receive the same number of votes it had in Congress. That is, the number of votes it had in the House of Representatives plus 2. That is the number in the Senate. So you can see here how precisely, how much the power of the states was embodied in the provisions of this Electoral College. And remember, the states had to receive the Constitution, had to call for a ratification election, and had to call for a ratification convention. So the states really had a lot of power over whether this new proposed document, the Constitution, would actually get accepted. And so the power of these states was acknowledged. The power of the states was embodied in the Constitution. And even though it wasn't exactly state equality, that principle of state equality and that principle of state power was still represented there. And then finally, if there were a tie in the Electoral College, the vote for the president would go to the House of Representatives, with each state getting 1 vote, okay? Now, I want to make a point here about that tie issue. Many delegates at the federal convention believed that a lot of elections would be decided by the House of Representatives, which, if you remember, was Madison's original plan. Remember, this is an era before political parties, and they imagined that there'd be multiple candidates for president. And so it was very easy to imagine that no candidate would get a majority of votes in the Electoral College. And so George Mason, one of the delegates, actually predicted that 9 out of 10 elections for president would actually be decided by the House of Representatives. So I think that's a really key point that gets overlooked a lot, that the principle of state equality was reflected in this new Constitution. This idea of retaining a lot of power in the states was embodied in the Constitution, and that ultimately it was believed that a lot of elections for president would ultimately be decided by the House of Representatives. But it didn't work out that way, did it? And so the question is, why not? Why not? I mean, what is it that happened? And how is it that we got to this crazy system that we have today? Well, to understand that, I actually have to move into that early history, the political history of the early United States, and to what was a completely unanticipated and unwelcome development, and that is the development of a two-party political system. Now, at this time, Americans, building on a tradition from Great Britain, actually believed that political parties were a bad thing. Maybe some of us think that too today, but they thought it for different reasons, or maybe some of the same reasons then. But the point was that they thought that parties were factions. They thought parties were self-interested groups of people who banded together, who pursued their own interests at the expense of the common good. And I guess I need to emphasize here that in many ways, whatever their particular interests, and by no means were the framers of the Constitution demigods or unself-interested themselves, they did have a conception that the delegates in the Congress would be pursuing what was interested or what was in the interests of the United States as a whole. And remember, they're growing out of a time where they were seeing a lot of regional pursuit of interest in the Articles of Confederation, a lot of smaller groups that were pursuing their interests and not thinking about the larger social or economic interests of the United States. So they hoped that this new form of government would allow the elected representatives to pursue the public good that as defined as the best interests of the United States taken as a whole. Okay, well, so what happened to challenge that view? Well, very quickly, within the first Congress, we begin to see divisions emerge among the representatives and among the leadership about what was best, what was the common good. And you get the emergence of the beginnings of the political party system, of the two-party system. You get Washington and Hamilton and what came to be known as the Federalists on one side, and you get Jefferson and Madison and what came to be known as the Democratic Republicans on the other side. And as you probably know, in general, things like, a strong centralized government versus a more decentralized government separated them. But also things like, what was the legacy of the American Revolution? Was it, as the Federalists believed, a legacy that called for the reigning elite to continue to govern and occupy positions of power? In other words, was it the preservation of a kind of hierarchical traditional social structure? Or was it a more radical vision coming out of the revolution, a more egalitarian vision that called for opening up of the politics and the political system and political office to a wider range of individuals and wider range of people, and to the pursuit of more principles of economic and political equality? And of course, bracketing that all the time, knowing that equality for both Federalists and Republicans at this time meant equality for white males. Okay, so these differing visions were exacerbated by the French Revolution, when the Federalists tended to side with Great Britain and pursue policies that were favorable toward Great Britain, whereas the Democratic Republicans favored France and believed that the French Revolution, with its slogan of liberty, equality, and fraternity, was an extension of the American Revolution, the fulfillment in some ways of the American Revolution. So what I want to emphasize here is, in the Constitutional Convention, the delegates did not anticipate and did not welcome the idea of a two-party permanent political system. But very quickly, after the first Congress began meeting in 1789, those divisions began to emerge, even though neither side wanted to call itself a political party. Nonetheless, it's clear that these divisions were deep and persistent and were on their way to becoming permanent. Well, I give you all this background just because without understanding the emergence of political parties, you can't really understand why there was so much change in the context in which the Electoral College developed. And let me go back here. So political parties really changed the whole way in which people thought about voting, in which they thought about political candidates, the way in which elections were handled. People started to think about themselves as partisans, as siding with the Democratic Republicans or the Federalists. Instead of just being Americans, they started to see themselves as members of political parties, and they started to believe that only their candidates should be elected, and only their candidates would pursue the vision of the future for the United States that they wanted. And so partisan divisions in the 1790s were incredibly incredibly intense, incredibly antagonistic. I mean, I say, you know, as bad as they are now, it was comparable in the 1790s. People would go to the other side of the street if they saw a member of the opposing political party. They wore badges that identified whether they supported the Democratic Republicans or the Federalists. They went to different taverns. They took different ferries. There were violent confrontations on the street and even in Congress between Democratic Republicans and Federalists. So it was a very contentious time. These party divisions came fast and swift and really divided the American people. And that was then reflected in the political process and eventually reflected in the election for president. So very soon then you have some crises in the election of the president. In 1796, in 1796, electors cast their ballots in an undifferentiated way for both president and vice president. And so that meant that John Adams became president and Thomas Jefferson, who was a Democratic Republican, became the vice president. Now, while these two were on speaking terms, there was not much more than that between them. And during Adams' presidency, one or the other, Adams and Jefferson, often went for long periods of time to their homes, either in Massachusetts or in Virginia, and simply didn't speak to one another, communicate with one another. So that was a clear sign that something with the Electoral College was already off. It was very awkward, although it wasn't yet a crisis, I suppose. In 1800, just 4 years later, there was an even more controversial election. People in the United States clearly understood that the candidate running to represent the Jeffersonians, the Democratic Republicans, was none other than Thomas Jefferson himself. Aaron Burr was supposed to be the vice presidential candidate, but because when the electors cast their ballots, they were undifferentiated in the Electoral College, there was a tie. And so the election went to the House of Representatives, and it actually took 36 ballots in the House of Representatives before Thomas Jefferson was finally elected. And it is said, and if you saw Hamilton, the play, you know this, the musical, James Baird of Delaware actually was the one who cast the deciding vote, but he was a Federalist, and he did this because Alexander Hamilton, although he despised Thomas Jefferson, despised Aaron Burr even more, and signaled that he would prefer Jefferson to Burr. So that crisis actually led to the first reform, maybe the only significant reform in the Electoral College that we've had in over 200 years, and that was the passage of the 12th Amendment in 1804 that stipulated that electors must vote separately for the president and the vice president. Okay, so already within the first decade of the new nation voting for president, you see the emergence of political parties, and you see that the presence of political parties is reshaping the way the Electoral College is operating. And I want to just throw in a note here, kind of an aside, but not exactly. Although some individuals at the Federal Convention thought about the Electoral College as an independent body that would have an independent judgment on the candidates for president, that was a rather minority view, voiced mostly by Alexander Hamilton. And never in our history has the Electoral College functioned as an independent body who operated independent of the will of the votes in the states or from the people of the states. So, you know, there gets to be a lot of talk about, you know, faithless electors. And as you know, there was just a Supreme Court decision on this issue. Over the course of our history, there have been less than 200 faithless electors who did not vote as they were instructed to by their states. Even so, this recent court decision this past summer says that states can bind the electors, and states have the right and the duty to do so, and that this whole idea of the Electoral College as an independent body is really, whatever the intent, has not been the way that it's functioned over the past over 200 years. So I just wanted to throw that in because that's often something that comes up these days. Okay, so only two presidential elections in our history have actually ever been decided by the House of Representatives. That one in 1800 that I mentioned, and 1824, and that was a strange election as well because you had 4 presidential candidates, and that one is really something that the strength of those candidates, the regional strength, resulted in none of them getting the majority of the votes, and it going to the result going to the House of Representatives. And if you know your political history, it was disastrous for poor John Quincy Adams because Andrew Jackson accused him of having made a corrupt bargain with Henry Clay, and he was ultimately ousted in the election of 1828. Okay, so let's see what else. Let's see how else the emergence of political parties has reshaped the Electoral College over time. So as I mentioned, the states were given a lot of power, the state legislatures, to decide who would vote for president, okay? And this chart shows you that you can see that over time, the percentage of the state legislatures, the number and percentage of state legislatures voting for the electors goes down. It doesn't go down consistently, actually, but over time, by 1828, by what we call the second party system, the Democrats and the Whigs, you do get almost universal abandonment of the state legislatures voting for the presidential electors and a move toward popular election, that is the people voting to choose the electors, okay? Well, that is an incredibly significant move because, and so here you see that, but you see it reflected in the way that the state legislatures decide how their presidential electors should be apportioned. Now, bear with me here because this is rather technical and it's not, fun, but it is relevant, very relevant for today. So, again, the Constitution leaves the power of deciding how the electors should be apportioned up to the states. So, theoretically, even today, state legislatures could decide to apportion their presidential electors by districts that resemble districts for Congress, electing congressmen, or it could decide to proportionately apportion their presidential electors based strictly on the popular vote within their state. But somehow, and as you see here, by 1836, even before the Civil War, most of the states were deciding to give all of their presidential electors to the presidential candidate who won the majority of the vote, okay? We call that the general ticket system or the at-large system or the winner-take-all system, okay? Now, what other choices were used? Well, I mean, throughout this period, states experimented with this district system, with varying methods of electing the president. But again, they gravitated toward this winner-take-all system. Why? Well, let me give you a quote from one congressman who spoke out on this issue in 1860. "A small state, unanimous for one candidate, might, by a general ticket, counterbalance the weight of two large states voting by districts. A small state, unanimous for one candidate, might, by general ticket, counterbalance the weight of two large states voting by district. In other words, states figured out that the way to maximize their impact on the presidential election was to move toward a winner-take-all system. And that's why today we still have, except in two states, a winner-take-all system. States realize that if they divide their votes according to the proportion of the vote that a presidential candidate receives within the state, that they are lessening their impact on the outcome. And this ties up with political parties because, of course, the majority party in any given state wants to maximize the power of that political party within the state. So this move toward at-large or winner-take-all system began, again, very early in our history and has persisted throughout the history. And so many Americans, look at this system now and are just horrified. But you see how political parties really have reshaped the Electoral College within decades of the emergence of this new system of governance. Now, we get to the really great point of contention, the elections in which the popular vote is different from the Electoral College vote. And so we have 1824, Jackson and John Quincy Adams. We have 1876, Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes, 1888 with Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison, and as we know, 2000 with Al Gore and George W. Bush, 2016, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And we are, unfortunately, the heirs of this system that does not take into account the popular vote in voting for the president, but does have this system that is a legacy of the equal vote for states provision from colonial times to the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution. So what now? And just to sort of vividly illustrate the problem, you see here what the state's vote would look like without the Electoral College, and you see here what it looks like with the Electoral College. Without the Electoral College, with the Electoral College. So, obviously states with more population do have a greater weight, but here's the key. In many, many elections, this difference, because it is basically reflective of population, doesn't make a difference and doesn't change the outcome in the Electoral College. 5 elections in over 200 years, that's not a lot of elections where the Electoral College and the popular vote have been divergent. But again, we've lived through 2 of these. But here's where the sticking point comes in, okay? In the past 20 years, what's happened is that with political party polarization, the Republicans have gained a political edge because more red states, more Republican states with lesser population get an advantage in the Electoral College than the large states, which are blue states and which would have the edge if it were simply a vote by population. So what's happened is that what we're seeing here in the Electoral College is the reflection of political party polarization that gives an advantage in the Electoral College to the Republicans. And for that reason, most of the people who support the reform of the Electoral College tend to be Democrats, okay? We can talk some more about that in the question and answer period, but I think it has to be acknowledged that the Republicans have an Electoral College advantage over the Democrats, and that if it were strictly a popular vote, the Democrats would have an advantage in the presidential elections. I think that needs to be said. I think that needs to be laid out on the table, because when we talk about remedies, we need to be aware of the possibilities, but also the limitations. Two states, as you probably know, Nebraska and Maine, actually do have some remnant of that district system or proportional vote for the president. Nebraska and Maine, and of course they are very small states in terms of their number of electoral votes. But if states and if people in the states really want to promote the principle of one person, one vote, that is, every vote counts the same within a state, they could do that by pushing for proportional representation within their state, or a district-based system within their state. That would be approaching this principle of popular election of the presidential electors, but it would be within the states, not in the United States as an undifferentiated mass. And it has the limitations as our predecessors, as our forebears discovered in the early 19th century, that it diminishes the power of the states potentially in electing the president, because it's not a winner-take-all system anymore. The Republicans and the Democrats would get some votes within each state, presumably. Second, there has been a lot of attention in recent years to the National Popular Voter Interstate Compact, okay? Under this agreement, states agree, state legislatures have passed this law, agreeing to pledge their electoral votes to the candidate who wins the US popular vote. Okay, I want to restate that. State legislatures agree that to pledge their electoral votes to the candidate who wins the popular vote within the United States. Currently, 15 states and the District of Columbia have passed this, but it won't go into effect until the number of states reaches past 270 electoral votes. Okay, now this is a system of bypassing, amending the Constitution. And on the face of it, it sounds kind of exciting, and it sounds like a way that we could possibly get a more popularly vote-based election of the president without going through Congress. I will issue a caveat here, though. It is very likely, at the very least, to face, if it is ever implemented, intense challenges within the courts, the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, because Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution explicitly states that Congress needs to approve interstate compacts. Congress needs to approve interstate compacts. This is bypassing Congress. And personally, I think that the Supreme Court would never approve the National Popular Voter Interstate Compact. Now, I will say that if it is possible for a Democratic House and Senate to get elected, and if they do pass this, then I think it is possible that the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact might be able to be a way of bypassing the or reforming the Electoral College. But I want to issue that really important caveat. That's not the way these reformers are approaching the issue right now. They're going through the state legislatures. Finally, the most difficult and challenging, but probably the most sound way of changing the Electoral College is by going through Congress, getting an amendment passed by 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and 3/4 of the states. As I said, it did happen with the House in 1969. It's been almost impossible to get anything through there then. And the reason is obvious. The Republicans right now enjoy an advantage in the Electoral College and seem unlikely to want to reform it. Will the Democrats ever enjoy an advantage in the Electoral College again and not want to reform it? Who knows? There's also another way that's never been tried. We've never had a second constitutional convention. Republicans have been promoting the idea of a second constitutional convention, primarily on the issue of balancing the federal budget for many years. They are actually fairly within striking distance of getting enough state legislatures to pass this. Once you have a second constitutional convention convened, most constitutional scholars believe that you cannot limit the scope of what it discusses. That is, this is a meeting of the people, and they could propose whatever they wanted to change radically or fundamentally or slightly the shape of the Constitution. Now, again, it would probably have to be ratified by the states, but they could propose anything. And this is a method that's never been tried. So, what do I say? I just want to emphasize that, there was no great theory or political philosophy behind the structure of the Electoral College. It was a result of many compromises, and that there's nothing sacred about it, and that its function changed radically with the development of the two-party political system, and that with the move to the popular election of presidential electors and the winner-take-all system, you had a very different kind of electoral college than what the framers imagined. And I think the problem today, besides the fact that it does reflect this political polarization in our country at this time, it reflects a tension between what you might call the federal principle, the idea of equal votes for each state, and the democratic principle of one person, one vote, which has become, over the course of 200 years, the predominant understanding of democracy in our country. And that's why I think the Electoral College rubs people so the wrong way, that it violates what we see as the central principle of representative government, that is, the majority rules. But the only way to understand it is that the Constitution was created in a time when this idea of one person, one vote, of all votes being equal, was just coming into being, when this idea of equality of political entities, of states, was much more common. And so I think the question, the challenging, frustrating, difficult question for us is, how can we make this Constitution or this system of electing a president more reflective of this ideal of democratic rule, one person, one vote, majority rules? So you can't clap, or I can't hear you clap, but I hope that you're clapping.